Hello, I'm Carrie Murray, President of ShelterBox USA, and I want to thank everyone around the nation who is participating in today's webinar. Today, we're going to focus on the Haiti earthquake. We're going to share with you what we know, how we're coordinating in the region, and we're going to hear from one of our ShelterBox response team members that responded back in 2010 to the devastating Haiti earthquake in Port-au-Prince. It was that earthquake back in 2010 when actually I first learned about ShelterBox. I was working on the ground amidst all of the rubble in Port-au-Prince, and I saw this humanitarian aid organization working to bring emergency shelter to, at that time, it was 1.5 million people that were displaced in an instant by that earthquake. So we want to thank you for being here today. We will allow you to submit some Q&A questions. We're going to try to get to them at the end. So feel free to chat in questions and we'll work our best to get to them. And if we don't, we will be responding to you via email after today's webinar. So it almost seems impossible that on August 14th at about 8:29 a.m. Eastern Time, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake hit about 78 miles just southwest of Port-au-Prince on the southwestern peninsula of Haiti. It was about 6.2 miles in terms of its depth, which is actually critical because the more shallow the earthquake, the more damage that can be done. And what we know so far is that there will be likely a very large need for shelter within the region. So we mobilized very quickly. It was minutes after the earthquake that ShelterBox began mobilizing, reaching out to our partners on the ground to really understand the impact that this earthquake had. Whole series of aftershocks, landslides, and then at that point, Tropical Storm Grace, which was due to hit Haiti. So we became very concerned. What we know so far is that we have about 500,000 people in the region that are in need of humanitarian assistance. About 130,000 homes and counting have either been damaged or destroyed within the region. There have been over 2,200 deaths that have been confirmed, and there still are hundreds of people still missing in the rubble. Thousands of people are injured. We also know that this is an area that COVID is beginning to really take shape and storm. There's been big outbreaks of COVID across the island. We have a population of less than 1% that have been vaccinated. So a lot of different concerns going on. We're also operating in a very challenging environment. This is an area that has experienced massive waves of violent crime, really the most since what they're saying is the mid-'80s. It's very politically turbulent. Last month, the president of Haiti was assassinated. We're working in an extremely difficult logistical environment of getting aid into an area that is rubble, mountainous area. And at this point, ShelterBox has deployed an assessment team to the region. They're staged in the Dominican Republic. And they're going to be really working through the very challenging environment of bringing aid into a disaster zone in a very violent and a very turbulent environment in the middle of a global pandemic. But what we do know is that whether it's a disaster, whether it's a crisis situation and a conflict, or even a global pandemic, at ShelterBox, we do know that shelter is one of the most transformational differences that you can make in someone's life. And for the people who've been affected in Haiti, ShelterBox will absolutely be needed, and shelter will be a huge, huge need within this country. So just to give you a little bit more perspective on the country of Haiti, we often look at what's called the Human Development Index when we're prioritizing our relief and we do our aid around the world. Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the world. So when you look at the factors that calculate what's known as the Human Development Index, you look at things like per capita income, you look at life expectancy, you look at educational level, and Haiti ranks 170th out of 189 countries. So it's very poor, it's extraordinarily vulnerable, and we know that families there will need help. So looking at some of the needs and some of the gaps, and I know that there's this strong sense of urgency when these disasters happen. There always is. There's an urgency to act. There's very little information to act on. And the first priority in these disasters is always search and rescue. It has to be. It's finding every single person that search and rescue can find alive, and that has to take priority before the humanitarian actors and the aid can actually move in. The first step for ShelterBox is really a needs assessment, and that's why we have sent a team to the region. This team, followed by a logistics team, which arrives today, will start the long haul of determining what's most needed within the region. We'll start to coordinate with other local actors on the ground, other nonprofit organizations, including local actors like Habitat for Humanity, our partners Rotary International, and obviously working in coordination with the government there. So right now it's really an assessment of who's been impacted, what are the needs, how do we ensure that we can coordinate efficiently and effectively to deliver humanitarian aid to a very complex region. So there's a lot of coordination that goes on among multiple actors. What we are hearing is that there are huge needs for medical support. We know that the hospitals are overrun. I think 24 health facilities were damaged or destroyed. They're inundated with people who are injured, as well as on top of that, COVID-19 patients that are coming in as well. We've heard that shelter needs are extraordinarily high, and then obviously needs around food, around safe and sufficient clean water, sanitation, and hygiene. So to give you some perspective for those of you that are new to ShelterBox, as a humanitarian aid organization, we focus on the delivery of emergency shelter and essential supplies in the aftermath of being displaced by a crisis, like this one in Haiti. The basic principles of how we operate, what we do is really based on what are the essential things that you need to sustain your life if you lose everything in an instant. The center of gravity for what we do is the emergency shelter. It often in the past, including in Haiti, has taken the shape of a family emergency tent, like the one that you see here. Looks like a recreation tent. It is not. This is a humanitarian relief tent. This is the place that a family will call home in the aftermath of a crisis. They will live in these tents for a period of weeks to months. The other things that we think about is that you've lost power. So we include solar lanterns, illuminated lanterns, so people have access to light. We know that you often have contamination of the water source. This is a huge issue in Haiti. So we provide water purification units, containers to store purified water. Aid organizations are bringing in food, water, but what are you going to boil water in? Prepare a hot meal. So we bring stainless steel cook sets as well. Basic tools to help with the repair or rebuild process. So really basic things, hammer, twine, duct tape, handsaw, really basic tools. And then essential things. You often see vector-borne diseases in these areas. So things like mosquito nets, blankets, waterproof ground mats. And this, what you're seeing here, is an aid item that we deployed a heck of a lot of back in 2010 in the earthquake in Haiti. ShelterBox was among the largest providers of shelter aid to the country after that displacement. Again, there were 1.8 million people displaced in the 2010 earthquake. And we were quick on the ground. We deployed tens of thousands of tents, of shelter boxes, and we served about 150,000 people with emergency shelter. These pictures are from Port-au-Prince, and you can see the tents literally in the rubble in that disaster because displacement was just so massive within that city. This was a disaster that took nearly a year for the organization to deploy and to meet the emergency shelter needs of Haitians at that time. And right now, as we do our assessments, we are going to be looking at really who's most vulnerable and what the needs are. And in addition to tents, there's a variety of other aid items that I'm going to share with you in a bit that we are likely to deploy in an emergency such as this, and that we deploy quite often in the Caribbean. But the purpose of what we do as an aid organization has never waned in 21 years, and it's the provision of emergency shelter to enable the recovery of families and survivors of these emergencies. Perhaps of all the photos, and there's thousands from our 2010 response, I think this one, to me, it really speaks to who we are as an aid organization and what we work to do. And it's to put a roof over the heads of these families and to give them a place to call home so that they can begin the long process of self-recovery for these families. The way that we operate as an aid organization is, I think, very unique. And I want to share with you and introduce you to a member of our volunteer response team. And I want to share with you a bit about how we operate in these complex environments. When ShelterBox was founded back in 2000, we were really founded on the backs of volunteers. And we built a civilian response and volunteer training program called the SRT, the ShelterBox Response Team. These are some of the most highly trained people in all of emergency response. They continually train like reservists to stay active. They have to deploy a minimum of once per year, and that's often for a period of several weeks. And they work through the very challenging environment of conducting assessments, determining who's most vulnerable, what the needs are, coordinating on the ground, delivering the aid, conducting our monitoring and evaluation, and they often put their lives at risk to do this work. This is really a huge tie that binds our ability to operate as a humanitarian relief organization, because we have far more volunteers than we have paid staff around the world. About 1 in 30 people will make it through the very challenging application and assessment process and become an SRT member. And I want to introduce to you now one of those members who has been with us since 2008 as a response team member. His name is Bill Decker. Bill has a very interesting background as a volunteer with our organization. In addition to deploying to Indonesia, to Peru, to Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, Bill was on the ground in Haiti in 2010 after the earthquake in Port-au-Prince. Bill is also a graduate of Georgetown University at the School of Foreign Service. He has his MBA from Thunderbird, and he has also been recognized with a Presidential Service Award for the thousands of hours he has volunteered his time with ShelterBox. So at this time, I would love to introduce to you ShelterBox Response Team member, Bill Decker. And Bill, I have a whole series of questions that have been sent in for you. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Carrie. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone who's joining us. It's exciting to share the ShelterBox story with you.
So, Bill, if we could just maybe start with, how did you become involved, and why do you do this? Why do you give thousands of hours of your time to serve on the front lines of these disaster zones?
Yeah, I'm the past president of the Rotary Club of Philadelphia, in fact, and one of the response team members back then, a guy named Bruce Sternley, came and told a story about his deployment to Peru after a earthquake. And I was so moved by his story as a volunteer that I immediately, turned to the rest of the people at my table and said, hey, we need to donate today. And we all, donated for a ShelterBox at that point. And then I went to Bruce and I said, hey, this is really interesting. I love how accountable the organization is, and how we're not just dumping a bunch of aid somewhere. We're sending volunteers to go make sure that that it gets there and that it's implemented. And how can I help this organization? So he suggested, based at that time, that I had a little bit of flexibility in my working schedule to go and try out for the ShelterBox response team, and start raising some money for ShelterBox too. So that's kind of the early days of it. And what really compelled me was, I looked around myself and appreciated the abundance that the world has given to me, and thought this is a really good way for me to do something to give back, to make a difference, and do more than just the status quo.
Mm-hmm. So Bill, we recently deployed Team One, as you know, and this is the initial step of conducting assessments. We've also deployed the logistics team. Can you talk a little bit more about what these folks are doing on the ground and how they're coordinating?
Yeah, it varies. It can vary disaster by disaster depending on the type of disaster. For an earthquake like this specifically, the team will show up usually in a two to four people that show up initially, and their purpose for their assessment is to determine what aid we might need there and where it might go. So from the moment you hit the ground, you're looking to establish your own base of operation there. Where am I going to stay? What's my security situation? Who else is here that can help us? You're looking for interpreters and drivers and people to help us get around. And oftentimes that comes through some of our partnerships, which we'll discuss a little bit later. We are gaining transport throughout the region to try to figure out where the heaviest damage is and what type of aid we might be able to provide. At the same time, that's usually dovetailed with some logistics folks who, as you mentioned, they're flying into Haiti today. And they come along and try to establish exactly how we're going to get the aid from wherever it's pre-positioned. Oftentimes we have aid in Panama right now that's going to be coming into Haiti likely. And how to clear customs, how to get transport in country once we're there. The disaster zone like this, oftentimes most of the driving routes are blocked up with rubble in these types of disasters. So we have to make lots of friends with people who have helicopters and get access to those helicopters to be able to deliver aid. And as time goes on, those transport routes will open up and we can move things along. And then the one other thing that we do is identify the beneficiaries. So once we've kind of established those things, we'll figure out where are these populations and who needs aid. And we'll start with that process of trying to figure that out, which again, we leverage many of our partnerships in so doing.
So for today's call, you sent along this diagram, and I know that there is an incredible amount of coordination and quite a sophisticated mechanism by which humanitarian actors coordinate in disasters. So can you share a little bit about how we actually feed into this system to ensure the effective and efficient distribution of aid on the ground?
Yes, this is the UN cluster system, and many of us might remember the 2005 tsunami in Asia was not only a horrible natural disaster, but it was a humanitarian coordination disaster. We had organizations running in all different directions, not talking to each other, pretty much working in their silos, and it breeded a lot of inefficiency in the delivery of aid. So after that, this concept was developed where you can see all the different moving parts on this compass. And so the cluster organization will have daily meetings that include all of these working parts of several different organizations that are there doing their specific work. And we'll coordinate to make sure that we're not sending a helicopter that's halfway full of aid up into the mountains when there's another organization that's trying to do the same thing and sort of eliminate the redundancies. And since it was put to its test in 2010 when I was there in Port-au-Prince, and it's evolved since then, and it was instrumental, and I think in helping us specifically to deliver our aid effectively. And we delivered almost a third of the tented shelter in Haiti that year.
Yeah, so it's quite intricate and there's so many moving parts, and obviously we feed within the shelter cluster of this whole grid, but there's so many things to think about, right? There's the water and sanitation I mentioned. There is obviously food security. There is the overall logistics, health. There's so many moving parts, and so partnerships become critically important for an organization. I always say we never go it alone. And that obviously in this instance, it was going to be a village of humanitarian actors and partners that we likely work with. So can you share a little bit more about that on the ground and the types of partners we work with and how we work?
Yeah, it's one of the first things that we do once we've sort of established our, where we're staying is who else can help us. Many organizations have sort of a permanent presence in many of the places that we go. And so we'll seek those out sometimes, but Rotary International, I would say, is one of the strongest partners that we have with 1.2 million people around the world. And we need interpreters and drivers and people who have warehouses and trucks. And every deployment I've ever been on, that was usually some of the first people that we were in contact with to assist us with getting some traction. And then we move from there to Habitat for Humanity or World Vision, Catholic Relief, ACTED, IOM, which is another really large organization, the Red Cross. It really comes down to coordinating through that cluster system and identifying who's doing what, and then leveraging those relationships. And over time, we've worked with all of these organizations. We have MOUs with many of them now. We really do have a lot of traction, and it makes us incredibly efficient at getting our aid into the field.
Mm-hmm. And I know in this instance, we're talking to a whole variety of partners. And what's really interesting is that we've responded to this region, the Lakai region, in the past. It's suffered some of the most devastation in the southwestern part of Haiti from the most recent earthquake. But unfortunately, we had to work there back in 2016 after Hurricane Matthew. And this is just a photo of our work back then with the Rotary Club of Lakai at the time. So I want to shift gears to aid. And I know you were on the ground in 2010. And at that point, the mainstay of our work at ShelterBox was, in fact, a green shelter box with all of those tools, the tent, the cook sets, the lights, the water purification. And we've since evolved a lot as an aid organization to really work to meet the unique needs of each disaster. And it's always different. And so I know that there's some aid pre-positioned in Panama. I have a photo of it. It's thousands of what's called our shelter kits, but maybe you can talk about that, the evolution of our aid and the types of aid we're likely to deploy in this instance.
Yeah, the original tent and box container with all of its items in it was a fantastic idea and was very effective for many disasters. But what we learned was that there really wasn't a silver bullet solution for the aid that would go in. Not every disaster needed a tent that was the size that the original tent was. And Haiti was a great example for that, because there was rubble everywhere, and there was no room to be able to put some sort of a tented structure on many people's property. And our preference is to keep people on their original residence and not move them into large camps and displace them that way. So from there, we developed the idea of a smaller tent that we could put in more urban environments, and then specifically the shelter kit that Carrie just showed a picture of, which allows people to repair their existing structure, to utilize what's left over, and patch it up temporarily while they look for a more permanent fix for it. And it's an incredibly flexible system that allows many different types of applications. You can see in this image, someone did their roof with one of the tarpaulins. Sometimes it might just be a wall of the house that got blown out, so they use it as a wall. There's possibilities are endless, and you can see some of the images here.
Mm-hmm. And that's an important distinction, I think, in that, there's 100, and right now it's 37,000 homes that have been damaged or destroyed. And so while there's a heck of a lot, I think it's around 70,000 that are destroyed, there's also many that are just damaged. And so if we can keep people intact, if we can keep them in place and provide them with things like these tarpaulins and tools where we don't have to move them and remove them from their home site or their community, they're likely to really recover much faster. So, Bill, I'd love to maybe talk a little bit more about the prioritization of families, because the reality for us is always, and the hardest part, I think, of this job is having to say no. There's not enough aid. And unfortunately, we do have to prioritize certain communities and people within these communities. So can you share a little bit more about how you do that and how we prioritize in the field?
Yeah, as a general statement, part of our expertise is finding populations that are somewhat removed from the main core of humanitarian response. We're pretty good at that, and within that construct, of course, we're always looking for the most vulnerable populations. Those would be people with disabilities, or in many cases, a family may have lost their primary breadwinner, and it's just a mother left with 3 young children. That would be considered a vulnerable population. Underrepresented minority populations that are oftentimes sidelined in some of these disaster responses. So we do go to great lengths in consistency with the SPHERE principles, which are kind of a set of standards that we all follow in the humanitarian world, to identify and get appropriate aid to the most needy in these disaster zones. And it's not always easy, because we do run out of aid, and there might be somebody who's left, like the gentleman you see here, and he's in a wheelchair, and maybe for some reason he doesn't end up being the neediest in that particular village, and maybe doesn't receive aid, and that's heart-wrenching when that happens.
Mm-hmm. And that's likely to be the case in this emergency. We know that 60% of Haitians live under the poverty line, limited ability to self-recover even after that 2010 earthquake. We see 300,000 people still in informal settlements, tens of thousands of people still displaced. So they are definitely going to be vulnerable and need our help. And I think, I'd love for you to share, Bill, if you could, maybe a story. And I know you have many. You have thousands of hours you volunteered with this organization, but if you could share with us maybe one that stands out that is part of you.
Yeah, sure. This image that you see here is the original. Every hospital in 2010 was destroyed, and so the only hospital in the entire country that was functioning was this medical center right next. This is the grounds of the Port-au-Prince airport, and so the original structures that were used for surgeries were actually ShelterBox tents before they got the big circus tent set up. And they had a 97% infection rate, and there were crush injuries everywhere, and this is where everybody was brought who needed any medical assistance. So you can see our living quarters were just adjacent to that medical center, and they were also using our ShelterBox tents for the morgue and isolation. So the extent of the damage to this civilization in Haiti was very evident to us as response team members, where we daily existed there just off the tarmac of the Port-au-Prince airport. And I remember one specific story that I think will probably remain with me my entire life, and it drives me to continue to work with ShelterBox. And on a daily basis, a van would show up to the morgue tent, and it would haul away the deceased. So there's one day specifically that I remember where I heard this wailing. This woman was yelling up at the heavens. Sorry, it's a hard story to tell. She was screaming up at the heavens as if her life had been taken away, and I just remember the chilling feeling of looking over at our ShelterBox tents that were serving this purpose. And typically they bring out, a 6-foot long container of an adult-sized aluminum carrier. And in this case, it was a very small one. And so it was clear that this was this woman's small child that had perished. And there's that moment where you realize that you're about to go home, and they're not. And the feeling that you have is quite moving, because you go and you get on an airplane and you sail off into the sky. And I did that the next day, and I had this moment of reflection as I looked out the window with my fresh orange juice and warmed almonds, realizing that the deployment actually began right then and there for me to go back and tell the stories, share the impact that we have as an organization, and share the endless need with the rest of the world, and help to continue to drive our mission as an organization, and make a difference in places like Haiti.
Thanks for sharing that, Bill, and for the thousands of hours that you have spent your life doing this humanitarian relief work on behalf of ShelterBox. We appreciate and value your service so much. It is hard to believe, having been in Port-au-Prince and now seeing what's happening in Haiti all over again, in one of the poorest countries in the world. I think this is what, as an aid organization, we really live to do every day, is help these families, to bring hope, to help with, in some way, with the recovery process. And it's unbelievable to think that it's been about a week and a half and this Haiti earthquake has already really been removed from the headlines. And now is when the heavy lift, and now is the real work starts for so many humanitarian organizations like ShelterBox. And so there's a lot more for us to learn. We have right now just started our assessments and working through the long process, logistics process of how we're going to work in this very challenging environment. But every one of us, every staff, every volunteer, every member of this community is committed to helping families in Haiti right now, and also around the world where we're working. We will continue to keep you posted on our work. And one, I just want to say thank you to the outpouring of support that we are receiving. Many of you have called, many of you have written, how can you help? Aid organizations like ShelterBox only exist because of the private charitable support from all of you around the world that participate. And while Haiti made the headlines for a few days last week, it's dropped from the headlines. And so has so many other of the emergencies that we're currently responding to in Burkina Faso, in Ethiopia, in Syria, across the world, where we respond to both conflict situations as well as natural disasters. I want to say a big thank you to Bill for participating today, for all of you for taking the time to learn about the global humanitarian work of ShelterBox, and to all of our partners who make this work possible. Thank you so much. We will continue to keep you posted. We are going to be getting daily reports from our teams in the field. We'll keep you posted on our work, and thank you so much for supporting the work of ShelterBox. I've included our address here, shelterboxusa.org, for more information. You can also email me directly. My email is kmurray@shelterboxusa.org. And for those of you who have submitted Q&A questions, we will work our best to get back to all of you today. Thank you so much.